Tonight, we're stepping into the Ice Age. Not the cute animated movie with Manny and Sid, but the actual prehistoric nightmare that would turn your modern survival fantasies into a very short, very brutal reality check. We're talking about an era where literally everything was designed to kill you. The weather, the animals, the lack of food, the other humans, and even the water you desperately need to survive. This wasn't some romantic prehistoric adventure where ruggedly handsome cavemen painted beautiful art and lived in harmony with nature. This was 100,000 years of humans barely clinging to existence while the planet actively tried to eliminate our entire species. But before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now grab your favorite drink, turn down those lights, and let's journey back to a time when surviving until tomorrow was considered a major victory. Forget your morning routine of hitting the snooze button 3 times and stumbling to the coffee maker while checking your phone. In the Ice Age, waking up was literally a survival task that required immediate action to prevent death. And your morning checklist started with, "Am I still alive?" Followed quickly by, "Is everyone else still alive?" And, "Why is everything covered in ice?" Your bedroom was a pile of animal skins arranged on the frozen ground, shared with your entire extended family, possibly a semi-domesticated wolf that may or may not eat you if food gets scarce, and whatever parasites had decided to make your unwashed body their permanent home. The first thing you'd notice upon waking would be that your breath was creating visible fog clouds inside your shelter, which meant the temperature had dropped enough overnight that your exhalations were freezing in the air. This wasn't cute winter wonderland stuff. This was your body's way of telling you that you were living in conditions that were actively trying to kill you while you slept. Your muscles would be cramped, stiff, and painful from sleeping on frozen ground with minimal cushioning, assuming you'd managed to sleep at all between the cold, the hunger, the fear of predators, and the sound of other family members coughing, snoring, or trying not to freeze to death. Modern people complain about uncomfortable mattresses, but Ice Age humans slept on surfaces that would make medieval torture devices seem luxurious by comparison. The fire that had been keeping you alive overnight would almost certainly be dead or dying, which meant your first priority wasn't stretching, checking messages, or wondering what to wear. Your first priority was getting that fire restarted before everyone in your group developed hypothermia and died. No fire meant no heat, no cooked food, no protection from predators, and no way to survive another night. Your body would be covered in lice, fleas, and other parasites that were having their own morning routine of feeding on your blood and making your life miserable. These weren't just annoying insects. They were disease vectors that could kill you through infection, blood loss, or the various plagues they carried from other animals and humans. Your daily grooming routine consisted of picking parasites off yourself and hoping you got most of them. Breakfast, if you were incredibly lucky, might consist of cold marrow soup that had congealed overnight into a greasy, semi-frozen mess, or a frozen scrap of mammoth fat that you'd gnaw on like the world's most disgusting energy bar. If you weren't lucky, breakfast was whatever remained of yesterday's hunt, which could be nothing at all if the food had been stolen by scavengers, spoiled, or simply consumed by people who were hungrier than you were. Your teeth would be chattering constantly, not just from cold, but from the constant low-level hypothermia that was your normal body state during winter months. Ice Age humans lived in a permanent state of being almost too cold to function, which meant they had to work harder, eat more, and sleep less just to maintain basic body temperature. The concept of sleeping in didn't exist, because every hour you spent in your shelter was an hour you weren't gathering fuel for the fire, hunting for food, or working on the dozens of survival tasks that meant the difference between living another day and becoming food for scavengers. Your alarm clock was the biological imperative to not freeze to death, and it went off the moment your body temperature dropped enough to wake you. Your morning bathroom routine involved stepping outside into weather that could kill you in minutes, finding a spot that wasn't occupied by dangerous animals, and hoping you didn't get frostbite on body parts you really needed to keep. Toilet paper was whatever leaves, moss, or animal fur you could find, assuming you could find anything at all under the snow. Getting dressed wasn't a fashion choice. It was a life or death equipment check, where you had to make sure every piece of animal skin clothing was properly secured, not torn, and still capable of keeping you alive in sub-zero temperatures. Your entire wardrobe had to be perfect because a single gap in your clothing could result in fatal heat loss within hours. Your morning beverage was whatever water you could melt from snow or ice, assuming you had enough fuel to waste on heating water instead of using it for more important survival tasks. The water might be contaminated with animal waste, parasites, or bacteria that could kill you, but dehydration would definitely kill you faster, so you drank it anyway. The morning weather report consisted of sticking your head outside and determining whether today would be merely life-threatening or completely impossible to survive. There were no meteorologists, no weather forecasts, and no advance warning about storms that could bury your shelter or drop temperatures to levels that would kill you before sunset. Your morning motivation came from the knowledge that everything around you was actively trying to kill you, and your only options were to work constantly to stay alive or die horribly from cold, starvation, predation, or disease. There was no weekend, no vacation days, no sick leave, and no retirement plan, except hoping you lived long enough to be too old to contribute to group survival. Every morning in the Ice Age was essentially waking up to discover that you'd survived another night in conditions that would challenge modern survival experts with all their training and equipment, except you had to do it with Stone Age technology and the constant knowledge that tomorrow might be the day your luck ran out. Your ancestors didn't wake up refreshed and ready to tackle the day. They woke up exhausted, hungry, cold, and terrified. But they got up anyway, because the alternative was death. And somehow, they did this every morning, for thousands of years, until the climate finally warmed enough that survival became slightly less impossible. Here's the uncomfortable truth that's going to destroy your Ice Age survival fantasies. Your modern human body is essentially a tropical animal that's been pampered by central heating, processed food, and medical care for so many generations that you're basically a hairless chihuahua trying to survive in conditions designed for Arctic wolves. Most modern humans are built like basketball players when they need to be built like fire hydrants. You're too tall, too lean, too long-limbed, and have way too much surface area exposed to cold air. Ice Age humans were short, stocky, and built like human radiators, compact, efficient, and designed to conserve every single calorie of heat their bodies could produce. Your ancestors looked like they were designed by engineers who understood thermodynamics. They had shorter arms and legs, broader chests, and more muscle mass concentrated around their vital organs. They were basically human furnaces wrapped in extra insulation, while you're more like a space heater that someone forgot to plug in. The average Ice Age human was about 5 feet tall and built like a powerlifter who specialized in surviving sub-zero temperatures. Modern humans are taller, leaner, and have longer limbs that are perfect for dissipating heat in warm climates, but absolutely terrible for conserving heat when the outside temperature could kill you in minutes. Your body fat percentage is probably optimized for looking good in modern clothes, but Ice Age survival required fat reserves that would make modern fitness instructors weep. You needed enough stored energy to survive weeks without food, while still maintaining body temperature in conditions that would make polar bears uncomfortable. Most modern people would burn through their fat reserves in about 36 hours of Ice Age living. Once your body started consuming its own fat stores, you'd enter the hallucination phase of starvation, where your brain would start shutting down non-essential functions, and you'd begin seeing things that weren't there. Ice Age humans were accustomed to operating while mildly starving, but you'd lose your mind long before you learned to function on minimal calories. Your hands and feet are probably soft, thin-skinned, and completely unprepared for the kind of cold that could cause frostbite in minutes. Ice Age humans had thick, calloused skin that had been toughened by constant exposure to harsh conditions. Your delicate modern extremities would start developing frostbite the moment you stepped outside. Frostbite in the Ice Age didn't just affect your fingers and toes. It could hit your nose, ears, and any other body parts that were exposed to wind and cold. Once frostbite set in, the affected tissue would die, turn black, and either fall off or become infected. There were no antibiotics, no surgical amputation, and no prosthetic replacements. Your cardiovascular system is probably adapted for modern life with its regular meals, heated buildings, and lack of constant physical stress. Ice Age humans had hearts and circulatory systems that could function efficiently while their bodies were constantly fighting off hypothermia and operating on minimal nutrition. Your immune system has been softened by modern medicine, processed food, and relatively sterile living conditions. Ice Age humans had immune systems that were battle-tested against parasites, bacterial infections, and diseases that would put you in intensive care. Their bodies were constantly fighting off infections that would kill modern humans. Your muscles are probably trained for modern activities, like sitting at desks, using machines, and occasionally going to the gym. Ice Age humans had muscles that were developed through constant survival activities, hauling massive pieces of meat across frozen terrain, building shelters with their bare hands, and fighting off predators with primitive weapons. Your bones are probably optimized for a lifestyle that doesn't involve constant physical stress, nutritional deficiencies, and frequent injuries. Ice Age humans had denser, stronger bones that could handle the kind of physical abuse that came with hunting megafauna and living in conditions that would break modern skeletons. Your digestive system is adapted for processed foods, regular meal schedules, and a diet that doesn't consist primarily of raw or barely cooked meat and fat. Ice Age humans could extract maximum nutrition from whatever food they could find, including parts of animals that would make modern people violently ill. Your pain tolerance is probably calibrated for modern discomfort levels, headaches, muscle soreness, and minor injuries that modern medicine can easily address. Ice Age humans lived with constant pain from injuries, infections, and physical stress that would send modern people to emergency rooms. Your sleep patterns are designed for consistent schedules, comfortable temperatures, and safe environments. Ice Age humans had to sleep while remaining alert for predators, maintaining body temperature, and being ready to wake up instantly if danger threatened the group. Your reproductive system is optimized for modern nutrition, medical care, and relatively safe childbirth conditions. Ice Age humans had to reproduce successfully in conditions where both mothers and babies died frequently from complications that modern medicine prevents routinely. Your aging process assumes access to modern healthcare, nutrition, and protection from environmental hazards. Ice Age humans who lived past 40 were considered elderly because their bodies had been worn down by decades of surviving conditions that would kill modern humans in days. The brutal reality is that you're a delicate modern human who's been optimized for comfort, safety, and longevity in heated buildings with reliable food sources. Ice Age humans were tough, compact survival machines who were designed by natural selection to live in conditions that would challenge your body beyond its absolute limits. You wouldn't just struggle in the Ice Age. Your body would actively rebel against the conditions and shut down systems to protect vital organs, leaving you hallucinating, hypothermic, and completely incapable of the physical and mental performance necessary for prehistoric survival. Your ancestors weren't just tougher than you. They were literally built different, adapted for a world that would treat your modern body like a tropical houseplant in a blizzard. You think you understand cold because you've experienced winter, but Ice Age wind was like being attacked by invisible knives, made of frozen air that could slice through every layer of protection you had and kill you faster than the temperature alone ever could. The wind was what turned uncomfortably cold into dead in 20 minutes and transformed survivable weather into a death sentence. Modern people experience wind chill as an inconvenience that makes them walk faster to their heated cars. Ice Age wind chill was a supernatural force that could drop the effective temperature so low that exposed skin would freeze solid in less time than it takes you to tie your shoes. We're talking about wind that could make negative 20 degrees feel like negative 60, which is the kind of cold that kills you just for existing in it. Your only protection against this meteorological nightmare was whatever animal skins you could layer together, sewn with sinew thread using needles made from sharpened bones. There was no Gore-Tex, no synthetic insulation, no modern windbreaker technology, just dead animal hide that you had to stitch together by hand and hope it would keep the wind from turning you into a human popsicle. The sewing process itself was a survival skill that took years to master and had to be perfect, because a single poorly sewn seam could create a gap that would let deadly wind penetrate your clothing and kill you. Every stitch had to be tight, every connection secure, and every overlap carefully designed to prevent wind from finding its way through your defenses. Ice Age humans had to become expert tailors out of pure necessity, learning to work with materials that were stiff when frozen, prone to tearing, and had to be shaped and sewn while their hands were numb from cold. They were essentially creating custom survival suits using Stone Age technology and materials that modern people would consider completely inadequate. The wind didn't just make you cold. It actively sucked heat out of your body through convection, turning your own body heat into a liability that the wind could steal faster than your metabolism could replace it. You became a walking heater that was being constantly drained by air currents that could strip away your warmth and leave you hypothermic in minutes. Getting wet in Ice Age wind conditions was essentially a death sentence, because water conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air, and wind accelerates that process until you're losing body heat faster than humanly possible to replace. If your clothing got soaked from snow, rain, or sweat, you had minutes to get dry and warm before hypothermia shut down your vital organs. The wind also carried snow, ice crystals, and frozen particles that could blind you, cut your exposed skin, and make it impossible to see predators, obstacles, or shelter until you walked directly into them. Ice Age blizzards weren't just snowstorms. They were whirling walls of frozen debris that could disorient you so completely that you'd get lost 10 feet from your own shelter. Wind chill could make your extremities so cold that they'd lose all sensation, which meant you couldn't feel frostbite setting in, couldn't grip tools properly, and couldn't perform the manual dexterity tasks that were essential for survival. Your hands and feet would essentially stop working as functional body parts while you still needed them to build fires, use weapons, and keep yourself alive. The psychological impact of constant wind was almost as dangerous as the physical effects. The sound of howling wind created anxiety, made it impossible to hear approaching predators, and contributed to the kind of mental stress that could break your ability to make rational survival decisions. Ice Age humans had to maintain focus and clarity while being constantly assaulted by noise that would drive modern people to psychological breakdown. Wind also made fire maintenance incredibly difficult because it could blow out flames, scatter embers, and make it nearly impossible to keep the heat sources that were essential for survival. Every fire had to be carefully protected from wind, which meant building windbreaks and shelters that could contain flames without being blown apart by the same forces that were trying to extinguish your only source of warmth. Hunting in windy conditions was a nightmare because wind affected the flight of spears and arrows, carried your scent to prey animals, and made it impossible to hear or track the animals you needed to kill for food. The wind could turn a successful hunt into a deadly failure by making weapons ineffective and alerting prey to your presence from miles away. Sleep became nearly impossible in high winds, because the constant noise, movement, and threat of your shelter being damaged or destroyed meant you had to remain alert even when your body desperately needed rest. Ice Age humans had to learn to sleep through conditions that would keep modern people awake for days. The wind could also change direction suddenly, bringing new weather systems, different temperatures, and altered survival conditions that required immediate adaptation. What had been a manageable survival situation could become lethal in minutes when the wind shifted and brought Arctic air masses, snowstorms, or conditions that made your current shelter completely inadequate. Ice Age humans developed sophisticated knowledge of wind patterns, directions, and weather signs that allowed them to predict and prepare for dangerous conditions. They had to become amateur meteorologists whose forecasting accuracy determined whether their families would live through the night. The wind was what made Ice Age survival truly impossible for modern people, because it was the factor that could defeat every other preparation and adaptation. You could have perfect clothing, adequate shelter, and sufficient food, but the wrong wind conditions could strip away all your advantages and kill you faster than any predator or temperature alone. Your ancestors didn't just survive Ice Age wind. They learned to work with it, predict it, and build their entire survival strategies around the reality that the air itself was trying to kill them every single day. They developed techniques and knowledge that allowed them to live in conditions where the wind alone could defeat every modern survival technology we have today. The wind was the Ice Age's secret weapon against human survival, and it's the reason why you wouldn't last a day in conditions that your ancestors endured for thousands of years. Forget everything you learned from those cheerful survival shows, where the host finds delicious berries growing conveniently nearby and digs up nutritious roots with a stick. In the Ice Age, foraging was essentially playing a deadly game of find the food, where 90% of the playing field was buried under 2 feet of snow, and the remaining 10% was frozen solid or guarded by animals that could kill you. You think you could survive by gathering plant foods because you've seen people do it on TV. But Ice Age foraging was like trying to shop for groceries in a supermarket where all the shelves are empty. The building is buried in ice, and everything edible disappeared 6 months ago when winter started. Those convenient berries you're planning to live on, they're under snow that's deeper than you are tall. The roots and tubers that survival guides tell you to dig for are frozen into the ground so hard that you'd need modern excavation equipment to reach them, assuming you could even remember where they were growing, before everything got buried under an ice sheet that won't melt for another 8 months. Your primitive digging tools would break before you made any progress. Even if you somehow managed to find plant foods, the nutritional reality of Ice Age survival would crush your vegetarian fantasies faster than a mammoth stampede. You needed over 4,000 calories per day just to maintain basic body function in sub-zero temperatures, and plant foods in Arctic conditions provide roughly the same nutritional value as eating slightly flavored ice cubes. Ice Age humans weren't primarily foragers. They were predators who had learned that meat and fat were the only reliable sources of the calories and nutrients they needed to survive. Approximately 90% of their diet came from animals they killed, because plants simply couldn't provide enough energy to keep a human being alive in those conditions. The few plant foods that were available seasonally were treats and supplements, not staple foods. Things like pine nuts, wild onions, or seasonal berries were valuable additions to the diet, but they were never the foundation of survival. If you were depending on plant foods to keep you alive, you were depending on a strategy that had already failed. Your foraging skills, assuming you have any, were developed for temperate climates with abundant plant life, predictable growing seasons, and the luxury of being able to afford mistakes. Ice Age foraging required intimate knowledge of which plants were edible under extreme conditions, where to find them during different seasons, and how to process them when they were partially frozen or buried under snow. The timing of plant availability was critical and unforgiving. Many edible plants were only available for a few weeks per year, and missing that window meant going without those nutrients until the following year. There were no second chances, no backup growing seasons, and no grocery stores to fill in the gaps when your foraging failed. Processing plant foods in Ice Age conditions required tools and techniques that took years to master. You needed to know how to leach toxic compounds out of certain roots, how to dry and preserve seasonal foods, and how to extract maximum nutrition from plants that were partially frozen or desiccated. One mistake in processing could poison you or waste precious calories. The energy cost of foraging in Ice Age conditions often exceeded the energy value of the foods you found. Trudging through deep snow for hours to dig up a few frozen roots that provided minimal calories was a net loss that would accelerate your starvation rather than prevent it. Ice Age humans had to calculate whether foraging expeditions were worth the energy investment. Competition for plant foods was intense, not just from other humans, but from the animals that were also trying to survive the same harsh conditions. Bears, rodents, and other creatures were often better adapted for finding and processing plant foods than humans were, and they got to the good stuff first. Storage of plant foods was nearly impossible without modern preservation technology. You couldn't refrigerate, can, or freeze dry your seasonal harvest, which meant that most plant foods had to be consumed immediately, or they would spoil and become worthless or dangerous. The abundance of late summer had to sustain you through months when nothing grew. Your modern digestive system is adapted for processed foods and probably couldn't handle the fiber content, toxic compounds, and rough processing that characterized Ice Age plant foods. Many wild plants that were edible required extensive preparation to avoid digestive problems that could be fatal when you were already operating on minimal nutrition. The seasonal depression that modern people experience during winter months would be amplified dramatically by the monotonous, meat-heavy diet that was necessary for Ice Age survival. Your body would crave the vitamins and nutrients found in fresh plant foods, but wanting them wouldn't make them available when everything was frozen. Ice Age humans who survived were those who learned to hunt successfully and consistently, not those who tried to live on seasonal plant foods and hope for the best. The successful survival strategy was becoming an efficient predator who could kill large animals and process every part of them for maximum nutritional value. Your romantic ideas about living off the land through foraging are based on conditions that didn't exist during the Ice Age. The land was mostly frozen wasteland where plants couldn't grow, and the few that did grow were inadequate for sustaining human life in extreme conditions. The joke wasn't that plant foods were hard to find in the Ice Age. The joke was thinking you could survive on them when the successful strategy required becoming a carnivorous predator who could kill megafauna with primitive weapons and process them efficiently enough to feed your entire group through months of winter. If you were planning to survive the Ice Age through foraging, you were essentially planning to starve to death while looking for snacks that didn't exist in sufficient quantities to keep you alive. You think hunting in the Ice Age was like those nature documentaries where skilled primitive humans elegantly take down majestic animals with perfectly thrown spears. Reality check. Ice Age hunting was more like a multi-day nightmare where you and 20 of your closest relatives tried not to get trampled to death while poking a furry school bus with pointy sticks. And success meant you got to spend the next week butchering a carcass in sub-zero winds before it rotted or got stolen by predators. A mammoth hunt wasn't a heroic adventure. It was a terrifying group suicide mission where everything that could go wrong usually did. You were essentially trying to kill an animal that weighed as much as a modern truck, had tusks longer than your entire body, and could crush you into paste with one misplaced step. Your weapons were spears with stone tips and maybe some wooden clubs, which was like trying to take down a freight train with kitchen utensils. The planning phase alone could take weeks, as your hunting group tracked mammoth herds across frozen landscapes, studied their movement patterns, and waited for the right conditions to attempt an attack. You couldn't just wake up one morning and decide to hunt mammoth. It required intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and perfect timing that one mistake could completely ruin. When you finally found a suitable target, your hunting strategy was basically surround the giant death animal and try not to die while stabbing it repeatedly until it bleeds to death. There was no backup plan, no emergency exit strategy, and no medical support when things went wrong. One charging mammoth could eliminate half your hunting party in seconds. The weapons themselves were masterpieces of Stone Age technology that took days or weeks to craft properly. Spear points had to be knapped from flint or obsidian with precision that modern people couldn't replicate, hafted to wooden shafts with sinew bindings and balanced perfectly for throwing or thrusting. A poorly made spear meant death for the hunter who depended on it. Your hunting armor consisted of whatever thick animal hides you could layer together, which provided approximately zero protection against mammoth tusks, cave bear claws, or saber-toothed cat fangs. You were essentially going into combat against apex predators while wearing the prehistoric equivalent of a bathrobe and hoping your teamwork was better than their natural weapons. The actual hunt could last for days as you tracked wounded animals across vast distances, following blood trails through snow and trying to stay ahead of the scavengers who were also following the same trails and hoping for an easy meal. A wounded mammoth didn't just lie down and die. It could travel for miles while bleeding, and you had to keep up or lose your investment of time, energy, and risk. Even success was dangerous because a dying mammoth could still kill you with its final movements. There are archaeological sites where human remains are found crushed beneath mammoth skeletons, evidence of hunters who got too close to animals that weren't quite dead yet and paid the ultimate price for their timing mistake. The butchering process was where the real work began, because you had to process several tons of meat and hide in sub-zero temperatures before it spoiled, while defending your kill from scavengers and other human groups who might try to steal the results of your risky investment. This wasn't just cutting up an animal. It was a race against time, weather, and competition. Everything had to be used immediately or processed for preservation, which meant knowing how to render fat, cure meat, tan hides, and extract marrow while your hands were numb from cold, and predators were circling the kill site, waiting for opportunities to steal food or attack weakened humans. The technical skills required were equivalent to running a meat processing plant with Stone Age technology. The weather could turn against you at any moment during the hunt, turning a manageable situation into a survival crisis where you had to choose between abandoning days of work and risking death in a blizzard while trying to salvage your kill. Many hunting expeditions failed, not because of the animals, but because the weather made it impossible to complete the process safely. Transport of mammoth meat and materials back to your group required additional days of backbreaking labor, as you carried hundreds of pounds of materials across frozen terrain, while remaining alert for predators who were attracted to the smell of blood and fresh meat. You were basically advertising your location to every dangerous animal in the region. The failure rate for mammoth hunts was enormous, and failed hunts meant that your group had invested days or weeks of energy and risk for no return, while burning through food reserves and exposing hunters to injury, death, or separation from the main group. The consequences of hunting failure were often starvation for entire families. Even successful hunts came with casualties, as hunters were injured by prey animals, suffered accidents during butchering, or developed infections from cuts and wounds sustained during the multi-day process. There were no antibiotics, no surgical repair, and no medical support for hunters whose mammoth hunting career ended with permanent disability or death. The psychological stress of mammoth hunting was intense enough to break modern people long before the physical dangers became relevant. You had to maintain focus, courage, and tactical thinking while exhausted, hungry, cold, and constantly aware that one mistake could result in your death and the starvation of everyone who depended on your hunting success. Your ancestors didn't hunt mammoth because it was fun, exciting, or spiritually fulfilling. They hunted mammoth because it was the most efficient way to obtain the massive quantities of meat, fat, and materials their groups needed to survive Ice Age conditions. It was dangerous, terrifying, and often fatal work that they did, because the alternative was starvation. Ice Age hunting was essentially prehistoric warfare, where humans used intelligence, cooperation, and primitive weapons to kill animals that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than they were. The humans who survived were those who became expert at this deadly profession, not those who tried to avoid the risks and responsibilities of being predators. You wouldn't survive a single mammoth hunt because you don't have the skills, physical conditioning, mental preparation, or cultural background necessary for that level of organized violence against megafauna. Your ancestors were professional big game hunters who had learned their trade through generations of deadly experience. Forget worrying about difficult human neighbors who play loud music or don't maintain their lawns. In the Ice Age, your neighbors were giant cave lions, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears, apex predators that could see you as either unwelcome competition for food or as food itself, and they had home field advantage in conditions that would kill you just for existing in them. These weren't the familiar predators you might encounter on a modern camping trip, where your biggest worry is a black bear getting into your cooler. Ice Age predators were evolutionary nightmares that had been perfected by natural selection to kill things efficiently in the harshest conditions on Earth. And many of them were significantly larger, stronger, and more dangerous than their modern relatives. The cave lion was basically a modern lion that had been scaled up by about 50% and adapted for hunting in sub-zero temperatures. We're talking about a predator that weighed up to 700 pounds, could survive comfortably in conditions that would kill modern lions, and saw humans as convenient snack-sized prey that was slower and weaker than most of the other animals on the menu. Dire wolves weren't just bigger versions of modern wolves. They were specialized Ice Age killing machines with bone-crushing jaws and pack-hunting strategies that had been refined over thousands of years of taking down megafauna. A dire wolf pack could bring down animals as large as bison, which meant that a small group of humans represented a relatively easy meal opportunity. Saber-toothed cats weren't just cats with big teeth. They were ambush predators that had evolved specifically to kill large animals quickly and efficiently using canine teeth that were designed like biological daggers. Their hunting strategy was to inflict massive trauma to vital areas, then wait for their prey to bleed to death, which is exactly what would happen to you if you encountered one. The short-faced bear was possibly the most terrifying predator in Ice Age North America, a bear that stood 12 feet tall on its hind legs, weighed up to 2,000 pounds, and was built for running down prey rather than the omnivorous foraging that characterizes modern bears. This was a bear that could outrun a horse and had jaws powerful enough to crush bison skulls. Your weapons against these predators were spears with stone points, wooden clubs, and maybe fire if you could keep it lit and weren't caught away from your shelter. That's like trying to defend yourself against modern military equipment using sporting goods from a camping store. The technological gap between your weapons and their natural armaments was so vast that survival depended on avoiding confrontation rather than winning fights. The worst part about Ice Age predators wasn't just that they could kill you. It's that they were smart enough to recognize humans as potential prey and developed hunting strategies specifically designed to exploit human weaknesses. They learned to follow human groups, raid campsites, and target isolated individuals who were away from the protection of the group. blood attracted predators from miles away, which meant that any injury, successful hunt, or food processing activity essentially sent out dinner invitations to every carnivore in the region. If you were bleeding from a cut, carrying fresh meat, or butchering an animal, you were advertising your location to creatures that were faster, stronger, and better equipped for violence than you were. The scent trails that humans left while traveling could be followed by predators for days, which meant that moving from one location to another was like leaving a roadmap for anything that might want to hunt you. Ice Age humans had to develop sophisticated knowledge of wind patterns, terrain, and predator behavior just to travel safely from one area to another. Nighttime was when most predators were most active, which meant that darkness transformed your world into a hunting ground where you were the prey. Your only protection was fire, which had to be maintained constantly and could be extinguished by weather, lack of fuel, or simple human error. One night without fire could be your last night alive. Competition for food sources meant that successful human hunts often attracted predators who were willing to fight humans for access to fresh meat. You might spend days killing and processing a mammoth, only to have a pack of dire wolves or a cave bear decide that your hard work belonged to them, and there was very little you could do to argue the point. The psychological impact of living surrounded by creatures that were actively trying to kill you was enormous. Modern people get nervous about spiders or snakes, but Ice Age humans had to function normally, while knowing that multiple species of super predators were constantly evaluating them as potential meals and waiting for opportunities to attack. Predator territories often overlapped with the areas where humans could find food, water, or shelter, which meant that basic survival activities required entering the hunting grounds of animals that were better adapted to the environment than you were. Every expedition for resources was also a potential encounter with creatures that could kill you instantly. The sounds that predators made, roaring, howling, or growling, served as constant reminders that you were living in their world, not yours. Modern people are comforted by silence, but Ice Age humans knew that too much quiet might mean predators were close enough to attack without warning. Injured predators were especially dangerous because they were desperate, unpredictable, and had nothing to lose by attacking humans who might normally be too risky to hunt. A wounded cave lion or saber-toothed cat could decide that killing humans was easier than hunting their normal prey. Scavenging behavior meant that predators were attracted to any location where humans had been successful, were processing food, or had left remains from previous activities. Your own success at survival created conditions that attracted the very creatures that were most likely to kill you. Ice Age humans survived by learning to think like predators themselves, understanding hunting patterns, recognizing territorial boundaries, and developing strategies that allowed them to coexist with creatures that were fundamentally better designed for survival in those conditions. They didn't dominate their environment. They learned to survive in it, despite being outmatched by nearly everything else that lived there. Your modern survival instincts are calibrated for a world where humans are the dominant predators, and most dangerous animals have been eliminated or controlled. Ice Age predators would treat you like prey, because that's exactly what you would be. A slow, weak, poorly armed animal that represented an easy meal opportunity. You think modern weather is unpredictable because sometimes the forecast is wrong and you get caught in unexpected rain? Ice Age weather was like living under the constant threat of atmospheric warfare, where the sky could decide to kill you without warning. And your 5-day forecast consisted of probably deadly, with a chance of definitely fatal if you're not prepared. Ice Age weather wasn't just cold. It was violently unstable in ways that would make modern meteorologists quit their jobs and become accountants. Fast-moving blizzards could appear out of clear skies and drop temperatures by 50 degrees in a matter of hours, turning a manageable survival situation into a race against death that most people would lose. These weren't the gentle snowstorms you might experience in modern winters, where you get advance warning, stock up on supplies, and wait it out in heated buildings. Ice Age blizzards were moving walls of frozen death that could bury your shelter, extinguish your fire, and kill you through exposure before you even realized what was happening. Sudden cold snaps could drop temperatures so low that your breath would freeze and fall to the ground as ice crystals. Your saliva would turn solid before you could spit, and exposed skin would develop frostbite faster than you could cover it. The temperature changes were so extreme that they could kill you just by existing in the wrong place when the weather shifted. But weather was just the beginning of your atmospheric nightmares. Dust storms created by glaciers grinding bedrock into powder could turn day into night. Fill your lungs with particles that would slowly suffocate you and create conditions where you couldn't see your own hands in front of your face. Imagine trying to navigate or find shelter when the air itself was trying to blind and choke you. Volcanic eruptions were a regular feature of Ice Age life because the planet was geologically active and unstable. When volcanoes erupted, they didn't just affect the immediate area. They could darken the sky for years, drop global temperatures even further, and create weather patterns that would challenge survival on multiple continents simultaneously. The sun could disappear for weeks at a time during major volcanic events, creating a nuclear winter scenario where photosynthesis stopped, temperatures plummeted beyond even normal Ice Age levels, and the food chain collapsed from the bottom up. Your already desperate survival situation could become completely impossible when the sun stopped shining. Acid rain from volcanic activity could contaminate water sources, kill vegetation, and create chemical burns on exposed skin. The water you desperately needed to survive could become poisonous, and there was no way to test for safety except by drinking it and hoping you didn't die from chemical poisoning. Atmospheric pressure changes associated with massive weather systems could cause physical pain, disorientation, and difficulty breathing that would impair your ability to make rational survival decisions when rational thinking was the only thing keeping you alive. Your body would be fighting against the very air around you. Lightning during Ice Age storms was especially dangerous because it could ignite whatever shelter materials you'd managed to gather, destroy your fire-making tools, and start wildfires that could spread across frozen landscapes where you had nowhere to run for safety. Your only protection from the cold could be destroyed by electrical discharge. Ice storms could create conditions where everything became coated in a layer of ice so thick that you couldn't walk safely, couldn't gather firewood, and couldn't access food sources or shelter materials. The world would become a skating rink where falling down meant potential death from injuries you couldn't treat. Hail during Ice Age storms consisted of ice chunks large enough to cause serious injuries or death, and there was no indoor shelter that could reliably protect you from bombardment by frozen projectiles falling from the sky at terminal velocity. The weather could literally beat you to death from above. Wind patterns during major storms could create conditions where the air itself became a weapon, picking up debris, ice, and snow, and hurling them at velocities that could cause serious injuries or death. You weren't just fighting against cold. You were fighting against air that was trying to kill you with projectiles. The psychological impact of living under constantly threatening skies was enormous. Modern people get seasonal depression from shorter daylight hours, but Ice Age humans had to maintain mental stability while the sky regularly demonstrated its ability to kill them without warning and without any possibility of prediction or preparation. Auroral activity was more intense during the Ice Age due to different magnetic field conditions, which created spectacular light displays that ancient humans interpreted as supernatural omens or divine warnings. The beautiful lights in the sky were reminders that cosmic forces were at work that could affect their survival in ways they couldn't understand or control. Solar activity during the Ice Age could affect weather patterns in ways that modern people don't fully appreciate. Changes in solar radiation could trigger climate shifts that would alter survival conditions across entire continents, making successful adaptation strategies suddenly obsolete and forcing human groups to develop new techniques or die. The lack of any reliable weather prediction meant that every day was a gamble with atmospheric conditions that could kill you faster than predators, starvation, or disease. You couldn't plan more than a few hours ahead, because the sky might decide to change the rules of survival without any advance notice. Ice Age humans developed sophisticated knowledge of atmospheric signs, cloud formations, wind patterns, and other weather indicators that allowed them to predict some changes. But they were still constantly surprised by weather events that exceeded their experience and challenged their survival strategies. Your modern weather apps, satellite forecasts, and climate-controlled buildings have made you completely unprepared for weather that actively tries to kill you. Ice Age humans didn't just endure harsh weather. They survived weather that was so extreme it could defeat every modern survival technology we have today. The sky in the Ice Age wasn't just the source of weather. It was an active threat that required constant monitoring, respect, and fear, because it had the power to kill you faster and more certainly than any predator or human enemy you might encounter. You think shelter in the Ice Age was just finding a nice cave and making yourself comfortable? Reality check. Ice Age shelter was an engineering challenge where one design flaw could kill you and everyone you cared about. And your building materials consisted of mammoth bones, animal skins, and whatever you could scavenge from a landscape that was actively trying to freeze you to death. Your shelter options were basically mammoth bone huts that took weeks to construct, cave mouths that were usually occupied by bears or other predators, or sod mounds that you had to dig out of frozen ground with primitive tools, while hoping the roof didn't collapse and bury you alive. Every shelter design was a compromise between protection and the risk of dying during construction. Mammoth bone huts weren't cozy prehistoric homes. They were architectural nightmares that required you to collect, transport, and precisely arrange bones that weighed hundreds of pounds each, all while working in sub-zero temperatures, with tools that would make modern construction workers laugh and then quit immediately. One misaligned support bone could bring down the entire structure. The construction process itself was deadly because you had to work outside in lethal weather conditions for extended periods, handling massive bones with bare hands that were constantly at risk of frostbite, while remaining alert for predators who were attracted to construction sites where humans were distracted and vulnerable. Cave shelters seemed like the obvious choice, until you realized that the best caves were already occupied by cave bears, cave lions, or other predators who had better claims to the real estate and were willing to fight you for it. Evicting a cave bear from its home was essentially declaring war on an animal that could kill you with one swipe of its paw. Even if you found an unoccupied cave, you had to worry about structural integrity, ventilation, drainage, and accessibility issues that could turn your shelter into a death trap. Caves could flood during thaws, collapse during earthquakes, or become blocked by snowslides that would trap you inside until you starved to death. Insulation was a matter of life and death, and your only options were animal skins, fur, dried grass, and whatever organic materials you could find that weren't already frozen solid or rotting. There was no fiberglass, no foam padding, no modern materials, just dead animals that you had to arrange in ways that would keep heat in and cold out. Poor insulation meant hypothermia, which meant death. Too much insulation without proper ventilation meant carbon monoxide poisoning from fires, which also meant death. The engineering requirements were precise, unforgiving, and had to be mastered using Stone Age technology and materials that modern people would consider completely inadequate. Ventilation systems had to be perfect, because you needed fresh air to survive. But every opening in your shelter was also a pathway for deadly cold to enter and kill you. You were essentially designing an HVAC system using mammoth bones and animal skins, and mistakes in airflow calculation could suffocate or freeze everyone inside. The smoke from fires needed to exit your shelter without taking all your heat with it, while fresh air needed to enter without bringing lethal cold. This required understanding of air pressure, thermodynamics, and fluid dynamics that Ice Age humans had to learn through trial and error. An error meant death. Structural collapse was a constant threat because your building materials were organic substances that could rot, shrink, expand, or weaken without warning. A shelter that was perfectly safe one day could become a death trap the next if materials failed or weather conditions changed the structural loads. If your shelter collapsed during a blizzard, you had minutes to dig yourself out and find alternative protection before hypothermia killed you. There was no emergency rescue service, no backup plan, and no one coming to help you if your engineering calculations were wrong. Flooding was another deadly threat because spring thaws, ice dams, or sudden weather changes could fill your shelter with water faster than you could evacuate. Drowning in your own home was a real possibility that required careful site selection and drainage planning using Stone Age technology. Water management around your shelter was critical because ice buildup could damage structures. Standing water could freeze and expand to destroy your foundation, and poor drainage could create conditions where your shelter became uninhabitable or dangerous during weather changes. Maintenance was a constant requirement because Ice Age weather was hard on every type of construction material. You had to constantly repair, reinforce, and replace parts of your shelter while living in it and depending on it for survival. There were no scheduled maintenance windows, just constant work to prevent death. Security was another consideration because your shelter had to protect you from predators while also being accessible for emergency evacuation. You needed to be able to defend your shelter from animals or other humans, while also being able to escape quickly if conditions became untenable. The location of your shelter determined your survival chances because you needed access to water, firewood, food sources, and protection from wind while avoiding areas prone to flooding, avalanches, or predator activity. Every site choice was a complex calculation with life or death consequences. Multiple shelter sites were often necessary because weather, food availability, or predator activity could make your primary shelter unusable. Ice Age humans often had to maintain several different shelters in different locations and be prepared to relocate quickly when conditions changed. The psychological pressure of living in shelter that could kill you at any moment was enormous. Modern people feel secure in buildings constructed by professionals, using tested materials and building codes. Ice Age humans had to sleep in shelters. They'd built themselves using whatever materials they could find, knowing that structural failure meant death. Your modern ideas about shelter are based on professionally designed buildings with reliable materials, building codes, and emergency services. Ice Age shelter was life or death engineering using primitive materials and Stone Age technology, where every design decision could determine whether you woke up tomorrow or died in your sleep. The Ice Age humans who survived were those who became expert at prehistoric architecture, materials science, and environmental engineering, not because they were interested in construction, but because inadequate shelter was a death sentence that killed faster than predators or starvation. You think hygiene in the Ice Age was just about being uncomfortable because you couldn't shower regularly? Wrong. Ice Age hygiene was literally a matter of life and death, where a small infected cut could kill you faster than a saber-toothed cat, and basic cleanliness was the difference between surviving another winter or becoming food for scavengers who would pick your bones clean. Your body was essentially a walking ecosystem for lice, fleas, ticks, and parasites that weren't just annoying. They were disease vectors that could transmit infections, cause blood loss severe enough to weaken you, and create open wounds that would become infected in conditions where infection meant certain death. You weren't just dirty, You were hosting a civilization of creatures that were slowly eating you alive. Lice weren't just itchy insects. They were carriers of diseases that could cause typhus, relapsing fever, and other conditions that would kill you through fever, delirium, and organ failure. In Ice Age conditions, where your immune system was already compromised by cold, malnutrition, and constant stress, lice-borne diseases were essentially death sentences with wings. Fleas carried plague, which could wipe out entire human groups in a matter of days. The same fleas that infested the rodents you hunted for food could jump to humans and spread diseases that would cause swollen lymph nodes, high fever, and death rates that made modern pandemics look manageable. One infected flea bite could kill your entire family. Infected cuts and wounds were probably the leading cause of death for Ice Age humans who survived predators, starvation, and environmental hazards. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no surgical procedures, just the hope that your immune system could fight off infections that had unlimited time and perfect conditions to spread throughout your body. Cold sores weren't just embarrassing blemishes, they were potentially fatal infections that could spread to other parts of your body and cause systemic infections that would kill you through fever and organ failure. What modern people treat with over-the-counter medications could become life-threatening conditions in Ice Age survival situations. Dental hygiene was a survival skill because bad teeth could kill you through infection, prevent you from eating the foods you needed to survive, and create abscesses that could spread to your brain and cause death through sepsis. A rotting tooth could literally kill you faster than starvation because the infection would shut down your vital organs. Tooth abscesses were common and deadly because Ice Age humans had to chew tough, gritty foods that wore down their teeth and created opportunities for bacteria to enter the root system. Once an abscess formed, it could spread through your jaw, into your bloodstream, and throughout your body, causing agonizing death from systemic infection. You bathed maybe once every few months, if you were lucky enough to have access to water that wasn't frozen, and conditions that wouldn't kill you through exposure while you were wet. Most of the time, bathing meant rubbing yourself with snow or scraping off the worst accumulations of dirt and grease with primitive tools. Soap didn't exist, so your cleaning agents were sand, ash, animal fat, and whatever abrasive materials you could find that wouldn't cause worse infections than the dirt you were trying to remove. Your idea of a thorough cleaning would barely qualify as getting started by modern standards. Clothing couldn't be washed regularly because water was precious, soap didn't exist, and wet clothing in Ice Age conditions was a death sentence. Your animal's skin garments absorbed sweat, blood, body oils, and environmental contaminants that created perfect breeding conditions for bacteria and parasites that lived in your clothing. The smell of unwashed humans in close quarters was so intense that it would make modern people violently ill. But Ice Age humans had to live with body odors that would clear a modern room because bathing wasn't worth the risk of death from exposure. You got used to smells that would hospitalize people today. Waste management was a serious health issue because human waste attracted predators, contaminated water sources, and created disease transmission pathways that could kill entire groups through dysentery, cholera, or other waterborne illnesses. Poor sanitation could kill you more efficiently than predators. Menstruation was managed without any of the products modern people take for granted, using animal skins, moss, or other organic materials that created infection risks and hygiene challenges that modern women can't imagine. Reproductive health issues that are minor inconveniences today could be fatal in Ice Age conditions. Food poisoning was a constant threat because food safety standards didn't exist. Refrigeration was impossible, and the meat you were eating might be partially spoiled, contaminated with parasites, or infected with bacteria that would cause illness severe enough to kill people whose nutritional reserves were already marginal. Intestinal parasites were universal among Ice Age humans because they ate raw or undercooked meat that was contaminated with worms, flukes, and other organisms that would consume nutrients from their digestive systems and cause malnutrition severe enough to kill people who were already operating on subsistence calories. Skin conditions that modern people treat with creams and medications could become systemic infections that would kill through sepsis, organ failure, or complications from constant scratching that created open wounds. Eczema, dermatitis, or fungal infections could escalate into life-threatening conditions. The psychological impact of living in constant filth while knowing that cleanliness could prevent death was enormous. Ice Age humans understood the connection between hygiene and health, but they had to weigh the benefits of cleanliness against the risks of exposure, water loss, and energy expenditure that could also kill them. Communal living arrangements meant that one person's hygiene problems became everyone's health crisis. Diseases, parasites, and infections spread quickly through groups that lived in close quarters, shared food, and had no way to isolate sick individuals or prevent transmission of contagious conditions. Your modern immune system has been weakened by antibiotics, processed foods, and sterile living conditions that would make you completely vulnerable to the infections, parasites, and diseases that Ice Age humans dealt with daily. You wouldn't survive the hygiene challenges that were routine parts of prehistoric life. Ice Age humans who survived were those who learned to balance hygiene needs with survival requirements, developing techniques for staying clean enough to prevent fatal infections, while not risking death through exposure to the cleaning process itself. They weren't clean by modern standards, but they were clean enough to live. Forget everything you think you know about making fire, from watching survival shows where the host creates flames in 30 seconds using modern techniques and materials. In the Ice Age, fire wasn't just useful. It was literally the difference between being a human and being a frozen corpse that would feed scavengers. And the process of creating fire was so difficult and unreliable that entire groups could die because someone failed at what looks like a simple task on TV. You didn't just make a fire in the Ice Age. You earned it through hours of backbreaking labor that required perfect technique, ideal materials, and conditions that rarely aligned when you needed them most. Fire-making was a high-stakes engineering challenge, where failure meant death from cold, predation, or inability to cook the food that would keep you alive. The bow drill method that survival instructors demonstrate in controlled conditions required you to carve perfectly dry wood with stone tools, create tinder from materials that weren't frozen or wet, and maintain precise pressure and speed while your hands were numb from cold and your body was weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Finding truly dry wood in Ice Age conditions was like searching for unicorns, because everything was either frozen solid, soaked with moisture, or covered in ice that would prevent combustion. You had to locate dead trees that had been protected from moisture, then process them with primitive tools while working in conditions that would make modern lumberjacks quit immediately. The striking sparks method required you to find iron, pyrite, and flint in landscapes where such materials might not exist, then strike them together with perfect technique while your hands were so cold you couldn't feel your fingers. One missed strike could mean the difference between warmth and death from hypothermia. Your tinder had to be completely dry, finely shredded, and arranged with precision that would make modern fire starters look casual. You needed materials like birch bark, dry grass, or fungus that had been processed into tinder that would catch sparks and sustain combustion long enough to ignite larger fuel sources. The ember nursing process was where most modern people would fail, because you had to blow on sparks with exactly the right pressure and timing to create combustion without extinguishing the fragile beginning of fire. Too little air and the ember dies. Too much air and you blow it out. The technique required practice that most people didn't survive to gain. Once you created an ember, you had seconds to transfer it to prepared tinder and build it into sustainable flames before losing everything and having to start the entire process over. In Ice Age conditions, you might only get one chance per day, because of limited daylight, energy reserves, and available materials. Guarding fire was a full-time job because flames could be extinguished by wind, rain, snow, or simple neglect, and restarting fire might be impossible if conditions had changed or materials were no longer available. Someone had to tend the fire constantly, which meant dedicating human resources to fire maintenance instead of food gathering or shelter construction. Fire theft was considered one of the most serious crimes in Ice Age societies, because stealing someone else's fire could mean condemning them and their families to death from cold. The penalties for fire theft were severe because communities understood that fire was literally the difference between life and death for everyone involved. Banking coals for overnight fire maintenance required sophisticated knowledge of combustion rates, fuel types, and airflow management that took years to master. You had to arrange fuel and coals in precise configurations that would maintain heat through the night without consuming all your fuel or creating dangerous smoke accumulation. Transporting fire during travel was an additional survival challenge because you had to carry burning coals or embers in containers that wouldn't extinguish the flames while also not setting your other equipment on fire. Fire transportation required specialized containers and techniques that added complexity to every journey. The fuel requirements for maintaining fire in Ice Age conditions were enormous because you needed enough combustible materials to keep flames burning for months at a time, while also competing with other groups for the same limited resources. Wood gathering was a full-time occupation that determined whether your group would survive the winter. Wet fuel was essentially useless because it wouldn't burn cleanly, produced dangerous amounts of smoke, and consumed more energy to ignite than it provided in heat. In conditions where most available fuel was wet or frozen, fire maintenance became an ongoing crisis that required constant attention and innovation. Smoke management was critical because too much smoke could suffocate people in enclosed shelters, while too little heat would allow everyone to freeze to death. You had to balance combustion efficiency with ventilation requirements, using materials and techniques that provided very little margin for error. Fire accidents could kill you faster than predators because burns in Ice Age conditions would become infected. Clothing or shelter fires could destroy everything you needed to survive, and smoke inhalation could cause respiratory damage that would be fatal without modern medical treatment. The psychological dependence on fire was so intense that losing fire was one of the most traumatic experiences Ice Age humans could face. Modern people who lose electricity feel inconvenienced. Ice Age humans who lost fire faced immediate threats to their survival that could kill them within hours. Competition for fire-making materials meant that good wood, dry tinder, and fire-starting stones were valuable resources that groups would fight over. Access to fire materials determined survival chances, which made fire-making supplies more valuable than almost any other resource except food. Weather conditions could make fire-making impossible for days or weeks at a time, forcing groups to maintain existing fires through conditions that made fuel gathering dangerous or impossible. Extended periods without the ability to create new fire could doom entire communities. Your modern fire-making skills, assuming you have any, were developed for recreational purposes under ideal conditions, with manufactured materials and backup options. Ice Age fire-making was life or death engineering, using whatever materials you could find in conditions that actively prevented combustion. The Ice Age humans who survived were those who became masters of fire creation, maintenance, and transportation. Not because they enjoyed playing with fire, but because fire mastery was the fundamental skill that determined whether they would live or die in conditions where fire was literally the difference between being human and being dead. Fire wasn't just a tool in the Ice Age. It was your god, your protector, your cook, your heater, and your constant burden that required daily worship through the sacrifice of time, energy, and resources that determined whether you would see another sunrise. You think parenting is stressful now because of screen time, school choices, and keeping kids safe from modern dangers? Ice Age parenting was a nightmare where more than half of all children died before reaching adulthood, and every day was a desperate struggle to keep your kids alive in conditions that were actively trying to kill them through cold, starvation, disease, predation, and accidents that modern parents can't even imagine. Infant mortality rates in the Ice Age exceeded 50%, which means that having children was essentially a numbers game where you had to keep producing babies and hope that enough of them survived to adulthood to continue your genetic line. Most parents buried more children than they raised, and grieving dead children was such a common experience that it was just considered normal human existence. If a child got sick in the Ice Age, there was no medicine, no medical treatment, and no pediatric care. Just the hope that their immune system could fight off infections, diseases, or conditions that modern medicine treats routinely. Childhood illnesses that are minor inconveniences today were death sentences that parents had to watch helplessly while their children suffered and died. A simple fever could kill a child through dehydration, seizures, or organ failure, while their parents had no way to reduce their temperature, provide safe medications, or offer any treatment beyond keeping them warm and hoping for the best. Watching your children die from treatable conditions was a standard part of Ice Age parenting. Accidents that would result in hospital visits today were fatal in Ice Age conditions, because there was no emergency medical care, no surgical repair, and no way to treat serious injuries that children sustained while learning to navigate an environment that was designed to kill them. A broken bone could mean death from infection or inability to keep up with the group. Malnutrition was a constant threat because children needed more calories per pound of body weight than adults. But food distribution was based on survival priorities that often meant children got the smallest portions during times of scarcity. Watching your children slowly starve while you were also starving was an impossible choice that parents faced regularly. If the mother died during childbirth, which happened frequently due to complications that modern medicine prevents, the baby almost certainly died too, because there was no formula, no bottle feeding, and no wet nurses available in most Ice Age communities. Maternal death was essentially a double death sentence that killed both mother and child. Childhood development was accelerated by necessity because children who couldn't contribute to group survival became liabilities that the group couldn't afford to support. Kids had to learn survival skills, food gathering, tool making, and adult responsibilities while still developing physically and mentally in conditions that challenged full-grown adults. The constant threat of predation meant that children could never be left unattended, couldn't play outside the immediate protection of adults, and had to learn to be quiet and still when dangerous animals were nearby. Childhood play was limited to activities that didn't attract predators or waste energy that was needed for survival. Exposure to cold was particularly dangerous for children because their smaller bodies lost heat faster than adults. They had less body fat for insulation, and they couldn't generate heat as efficiently through physical activity. Children were often the first to develop hypothermia and the most likely to die from cold exposure. Poisoning from eating the wrong plants, berries, or contaminated food was a constant risk because children were naturally curious about their environment, but lacked the knowledge to distinguish between safe and deadly substances. Parents had to monitor every interaction their children had with the natural world. Drowning was a serious threat because children needed access to water sources for drinking, but Ice Age water sources were often dangerous rivers, unstable ice formations, or deep pools, where a child who fell in would have no chance of rescue in conditions where adults couldn't risk their own lives for retrieval attempts. Separation from the group was essentially a death sentence for children who couldn't survive independently in Ice Age conditions. Kids who got lost, left behind, or separated during travel would die from exposure, predation, or starvation within days. which meant constant vigilance was required to prevent children from wandering away. Childhood trauma was universal because children witnessed violence, death, predation, and suffering on a regular basis as normal parts of daily life. There was no way to shelter children from the realities of Ice Age existence, which meant that childhood innocence was a luxury that didn't exist in survival conditions. Sleep safety was a constant concern because children sleeping in shared shelters could be accidentally smothered, attacked by predators that entered shelters, or killed by carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires. Every night presented multiple ways that children could die while sleeping. Growth and development were stunted by malnutrition, constant stress, and environmental conditions that prevented normal childhood development. Ice Age children who survived to adulthood were often smaller, weaker, and showed signs of nutritional deficiencies that affected them for their entire lives. Education consisted of survival skills training that had to be learned perfectly because mistakes could be fatal. Children had to master fire making, food identification, predator avoidance, weather prediction, and dozens of other skills while their brains were still developing and before they had fully developed the judgment necessary to apply those skills safely. The emotional toll on parents was enormous because they had to maintain hope and continue trying to keep their children alive while watching other families lose children regularly and knowing that their own children faced the same deadly risks every single day. Family planning was based on the assumption that most children would die, which meant having as many children as possible, while also recognizing that each additional child increased the resource demands on families that were already operating on subsistence survival margins. Weaning was a dangerous transition because children moving from breast milk to solid foods faced increased risks of poisoning, malnutrition, and digestive problems that could be fatal. The transition from maternal nutrition to independent eating was a critical survival challenge that many children failed. Your modern parenting anxieties about academic achievement, social development, and future opportunities would seem absurdly luxurious to Ice Age parents, whose primary concern was keeping their children alive until sunset. Ice Age children who survived to adulthood had overcome survival challenges that would kill modern children within hours. The Ice Age parents who successfully raised children to adulthood were those who accepted that most of their children would die, while continuing to invest everything they had in trying to keep them alive, against odds that would make modern parents give up in despair. Here's the part about Ice Age humanity that will mess with your head. Even while barely surviving conditions that would kill modern people in hours, and our ancestors found time to create some of the most beautiful and haunting art in human history. They painted masterpieces on cave walls, carved intricate figurines, and developed complex mythologies. Not because life was easy, but because creating meaning and beauty was apparently so important to human survival that they'd risk death to do it. The cave paintings at Lascaux, Chauvet, and dozens of other sites weren't created by people who had leisure time and artistic supplies. They were made by humans who had to risk their lives just to enter dark caves where predators lived, gather pigments from dangerous locations, and spend precious calories on activities that didn't directly contribute to finding food or staying warm. These weren't casual weekend art projects. They were spiritual and cultural activities that Ice Age humans considered important enough to die for. People literally risked being eaten by cave bears or getting lost in underground passages just to paint pictures of animals on walls that might never be seen by other humans. The pigments they used had to be gathered from specific locations, processed using techniques that took years to master, and applied using tools they had to create from scratch. Creating red ochre paint required finding iron oxide deposits, grinding them into powder, and mixing them with animal fat or blood, all while managing the survival requirements that could kill them if they spent too much time on artistic pursuits. Venus figurines, those small, carved representations of women with exaggerated feminine features have been found across Ice Age Europe, suggesting that people who were struggling to survive still found time and energy to create standardized artistic representations that had cultural or spiritual significance across vast geographical areas. The level of skill required to carve these figurines using stone tools was extraordinary, representing thousands of hours of practice and artistic development that somehow occurred alongside the constant survival requirements of Ice Age existence. These weren't crude survival tools. They were sophisticated artistic expressions that required technical mastery and cultural knowledge. Some Ice Age humans were experiencing visions and altered states of consciousness that influenced their art and spiritual beliefs. Whether these visions came from starvation-induced hallucinations, hypothermia-related delirium, or deliberately induced spiritual experiences, they created a rich mythological and artistic tradition that helped humans find meaning in impossible circumstances. The psychological effects of chronic malnutrition included hallucinations, altered perception, and spiritual experiences that Ice Age humans interpreted as contact with supernatural forces. What modern medicine would diagnose as symptoms of starvation, Ice Age humans understood as communications from spirits, ancestors, or gods who provided guidance for survival. Hypothermia-induced delirium could cause vivid hallucinations and out-of-body experiences that survivors interpreted as spiritual journeys, visits to other worlds, or communication with deceased relatives. The boundary between medical emergency and mystical experience was blurred for people whose survival depended on finding meaning in suffering. Storytelling became a survival skill because it allowed groups to preserve and transmit crucial survival information, while also providing psychological comfort that helped people maintain sanity in conditions that would drive modern people to mental breakdown. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were cultural survival technology. The myths and legends that developed during the Ice Age served multiple functions. They encoded practical survival information, provided explanations for natural phenomena that could affect survival, and offered psychological frameworks for dealing with constant death, suffering, and uncertainty. Shamanic practices and spiritual rituals provided Ice Age communities with ways to process trauma, maintain group cohesion, and find hope in conditions that would otherwise be completely demoralizing. The spiritual dimension of Ice Age life wasn't separate from survival. It was part of what made survival psychologically possible. Burial practices and treatment of the dead became increasingly sophisticated during the Ice Age. As humans developed concepts of afterlife, spiritual continuation, and respect for deceased community members, even people who were barely surviving found resources to honor their dead through ceremonies and burial goods. The development of symbolic thinking and abstract representation, evidenced by cave art, carved figurines, and decorated tools, represents a cognitive revolution that occurred under the most difficult survival conditions in human history. Somehow, extreme hardship accelerated rather than prevented the development of complex human culture. Music and rhythm were probably important parts of Ice Age culture, because they required no materials other than the human voice and body, provided psychological benefits that helped with survival stress, and allowed groups to coordinate activities and maintain social bonds during long, dark winters. The seasonal cycles of Ice Age life created natural periods for artistic and spiritual activities, during times when outdoor survival work was impossible. The long winter nights, when people were confined to shelters, became opportunities for storytelling, artistic creation, and cultural development that helped preserve human sanity. Group singing, chanting, and rhythmic activities probably served as primitive therapy for people dealing with constant trauma, loss, and psychological stress. These activities helped maintain mental health in conditions that would cause modern people to suffer complete psychological breakdown within weeks. The creation of personal ornaments, decorative tools, and artistic objects provided Ice Age humans with ways to express individual identity and maintain personal dignity, even when their survival depended entirely on group cooperation, and they had almost no personal possessions. Art-making activities probably provided crucial psychological benefits by giving Ice Age humans goals and achievements that went beyond mere survival. Creating something beautiful or meaningful provided psychological rewards that helped people maintain hope and motivation in otherwise hopeless circumstances. The transmission of artistic and cultural knowledge from generation to generation required educational systems and cultural institutions that somehow functioned even when most children died. Before reaching adulthood, and survival requirements consumed almost every waking hour. Madness and spiritual experience were probably closely related in Ice Age consciousness, because the psychological stress of survival could cause mental states that were interpreted as divine communication, prophetic visions, or supernatural guidance that influenced group survival decisions. The fact that Ice Age humans found time and energy for art, music, spirituality, and cultural development while living under conditions that would kill modern people within days suggests that these activities weren't luxuries. They were psychological survival requirements that were as necessary as food and shelter. Your modern anxieties about finding time for creative pursuits, spiritual development, or meaningful activities would seem absurd to Ice Age humans, who created some of the most beautiful art in history while literally dying from cold and starvation. They understood that meaning and beauty weren't luxuries you could afford. They were necessities you couldn't survive without. You think Ice Age survival was just about battling the elements and avoiding predators? Think again. The most dangerous creatures you'd encounter weren't saber-toothed cats or cave bears. They were other humans who were just as desperate, hungry, and willing to do whatever it took to survive, including killing you and everyone you cared about for your food, your fire, your shelter, or simply because you existed in territory they wanted. Competing tribes weren't just unfriendly neighbors who might steal your Amazon packages. They were groups of humans who understood that resources were limited, survival was uncertain, and eliminating competition could mean the difference between their children living through the winter or watching them starve to death. Every encounter with strangers was potentially a fight for your life. Territory disputes in the Ice Age weren't resolved through lawyers and property deeds. They were settled through violence that would make modern warfare look civilized. Groups fought over hunting grounds, water sources, shelter locations, and firewood with weapons designed to kill efficiently, and tactics developed through generations of deadly experience. A stranger approaching your group wasn't just a visitor who might want directions or help. They could be a scout for a raiding party, a spy gathering information about your resources and defenses, or an advance guard for an attack that would kill everyone you cared about and take everything you needed to survive. Violence between human groups was common and brutal because Ice Age warfare didn't follow modern rules of engagement or humanitarian conventions. There were no prisoners of war, no neutral territories, and no international laws. Just the understanding that losing a conflict meant death for everyone in your group. The weapons used in intergroup violence were the same tools needed for hunting and survival, which meant that every human you encountered was potentially armed with spears, clubs, and knives that could kill you instantly. There was no distinction between civilian and military populations because everyone was armed and everyone was a potential threat. Cannibalism wasn't just a desperate last resort during extreme starvation. It was sometimes a tactical choice made by groups who wanted to eliminate competitors while also solving their food shortage problems. Eating your enemies was both psychological warfare and practical nutrition management in conditions where every calorie mattered. The psychological impact of knowing that other humans might literally eat you if they got the chance was enormous. Modern people worry about being robbed or attacked, but Ice Age humans had to consider the possibility that successful attackers would consume their bodies as food while their families watched. Raiding strategies developed by Ice Age groups were sophisticated and deadly because they were refined through constant practice against opponents who were equally desperate and equally skilled. Successful raiders had to be expert at stealth, violence, and escape techniques that allowed them to take what they needed and disappear before retaliation was possible. The line between us and them was sharp and bloody, because group loyalty was literally a matter of life and death. You couldn't afford to have divided loyalties, sympathize with outsiders, or show mercy to people who would kill you without hesitation if positions were reversed. Children learned early that strangers were dangerous and that showing kindness to outsiders could get your entire family killed. Ice Age children were taught to be suspicious, cautious, and ready to fight or flee when encountering people from other groups. Alliance formation was crucial for survival, but alliances were unstable and could change quickly when resources became scarce. Groups that were allies during abundant times could become enemies during lean periods when cooperation meant starvation for everyone involved. Information warfare was practiced by Ice Age groups who spread false information about resource locations, weather conditions, or the movements of other groups in order to gain tactical advantages that could mean the difference between survival and death. Hostage-taking and slavery were probably common practices because capturing members of other groups provided forced labor, valuable information about enemy territories and resources, and bargaining chips that could be used in negotiations with hostile groups. The Geneva Convention didn't exist, which meant that warfare between Ice Age groups followed no rules except effectiveness. Torture, execution of prisoners, and targeting of non-combatants were standard practices, because showing mercy to enemies could result in your own death when they recovered and sought revenge. Betrayal within groups was a constant threat, because desperate people might decide that their survival chances were better with a different group, or that turning traitor could provide them with resources they couldn't obtain through loyalty. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed. Night raids were particularly terrifying because they combined the dangers of darkness with the threat of human violence. Groups had to maintain constant vigilance during night hours when visibility was limited and attackers could approach undetected until they were close enough to kill. Resource competition created conflicts that could escalate into multi-generational warfare, where groups maintained enemies lists and sought revenge for attacks that had occurred years or decades earlier. Blood feuds could continue for generations, creating cycles of violence that made peaceful coexistence impossible. Scouting and intelligence gathering were essential survival skills because groups needed to know the locations, strengths, and intentions of potential enemies. Knowledge about other groups was valuable information that could determine survival outcomes for entire communities. Defensive strategies required constant preparation and resource allocation that reduced the time and energy available for food gathering, shelter construction, and other survival activities. Groups had to balance security needs against other survival requirements in calculations that determined their long-term viability. Migration pressures caused by climate change, resource depletion, or population growth forced groups to move into territories that were already occupied, creating conflict situations where violence was inevitable because the land couldn't support everyone who needed to use it. Your modern assumptions about human nature, social cooperation, and conflict resolution are based on living in societies with laws, police, and institutions that didn't exist in the Ice Age. The humans who survived were those who learned to be suspicious, violent, and ruthless when necessary, because kindness and trust could get you killed. The Ice Age humans, who successfully navigated conflicts with other groups, were those who mastered the arts of war, espionage, and tactical violence, while also maintaining the social cohesion within their own groups that made collective survival possible. They weren't peaceful primitives. They were warriors who fought for survival against enemies who looked exactly like them. You wouldn't survive Ice Age conflicts with other humans because you don't have the psychological preparation, tactical knowledge, or moral flexibility necessary to kill people who are trying to kill you in conditions where showing mercy means condemning your own family to death. Here's the one thing that might give you false hope about Ice Age survival. You wouldn't be facing those impossible conditions alone. But before you get too optimistic, remember that Ice Age community wasn't like your modern social network, where people help you move apartments and bring casseroles when you're sick. This was life or death interdependence, where everyone's survival depended on everyone else's performance, and failure by any individual could doom the entire group. You didn't survive alone in the Ice Age, because survival alone was literally impossible. Nobody did. The humans who made it through those conditions were those who learned to function as part of survival units, where every person had to contribute essential skills, and losing even one group member could mean death for everyone else. Shared kills weren't about being generous with your food. They were about survival mathematics, where one successful hunt had to feed multiple people for extended periods. And the only way to process, preserve, and defend large amounts of meat was through coordinated group effort. Individual hunters who tried to keep kills to themselves would lose everything to scavengers and predators. Shared fire was essential because maintaining multiple fires required more fuel and attention than most groups could afford, and losing your group's fire meant depending on others who might not be willing to share with people who couldn't contribute to fire maintenance. Fire sharing was both practical cooperation and insurance against the death sentence of losing your own flames. Shared grief wasn't just emotional support. It was psychological survival strategy that helped group members process trauma and loss without becoming so depressed or broken that they couldn't contribute to group survival. People who couldn't handle the constant death and suffering became liabilities that threatened everyone's survival. Elders were respected, not because Ice Age humans had better family values than modern people, but because elderly individuals who had survived to old age possessed decades of survival knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death during crisis situations. Elder knowledge was literally more valuable than gold because it could save everyone's lives. The respect for elders was also practical because older people who were no longer capable of hunting or heavy labor could still contribute through childcare, toolmaking, food processing, and knowledge transmission that freed younger adults for the most dangerous survival activities. Children were protected with intensity that modern parents can't imagine because every child represented years of investment, potential future survival skills, and genetic continuation that groups couldn't afford to lose. But this protection came with expectations that children would contribute to group survival as soon as they were physically capable. The protection of children was also strategic because groups with more surviving children had better chances of long-term survival, more hands available for survival work, and greater ability to recover from losses that would doom groups with fewer people. If you lost your tribe, you lost your life, not just because of emotional devastation, but because individual survival in Ice Age conditions was mathematically impossible. People who were separated from their groups died from exposure, predation, starvation, or inability to maintain the complex survival requirements that demanded multiple people working together. Group cooperation wasn't based on love, friendship, or moral principles. It was based on the practical understanding that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's contribution, and that individual selfishness or failure could kill the entire group through resource depletion or inability to handle survival challenges. Survival roles within groups were specialized. because the range of skills required for Ice Age survival was too broad for any individual to master completely. Groups needed people who specialized in hunting, tool-making, fire maintenance, food processing, childcare, and weather prediction, and losing specialists could cripple the group's survival capabilities. The social pressure to contribute was enormous because people who couldn't or wouldn't pull their weight became survival liabilities that the group couldn't afford to support. Being unable to contribute your share of survival work was essentially a death sentence because groups couldn't waste resources on people who didn't provide value. Conflict resolution within groups was essential because internal disputes could destroy the cooperation that everyone's survival depended on. Groups that couldn't resolve conflicts peacefully would split apart or waste energy on internal fighting, both of which could be fatal in Ice Age conditions. Decision-making was probably more democratic than you'd expect, because survival decisions affected everyone equally, and groups that made bad choices died together. Everyone had incentives to participate in decision-making because the consequences of poor choices could kill them, regardless of their role in making those choices. Knowledge sharing was mandatory because survival information that was hoarded by individuals died with them when they were killed or injured. Groups that shared survival knowledge had better chances of maintaining essential skills, even when individual experts were lost to accidents, predation, or disease. Resource sharing wasn't communist ideology. It was survival insurance that ensured everyone had access to the materials they needed to contribute to group survival. People who hoarded resources while others lacked essential tools or materials were creating conditions that could destroy the group's survival capabilities. Mutual defense was the only way to survive attacks from predators or other human groups, because individual fighters couldn't handle threats that required coordinated responses. Groups that couldn't work together defensively would be eliminated by threats that well-coordinated groups could handle successfully. The psychological support that group members provided each other was essential for maintaining the mental stability necessary for making rational survival decisions. People who broke down psychologically became dangers to themselves and others. So maintaining group morale was a survival necessity. Social bonds within Ice Age groups were probably stronger than modern friendships or family relationships, because they were forged through shared survival experiences that modern people can't imagine. When you've depended on someone to help you not die on a daily basis, the relationship dynamics are completely different from modern social connections. Your modern individualism and self-reliance would be fatal weaknesses in Ice Age conditions, because they're based on living in a world with institutional support systems, emergency services, and social safety nets that didn't exist in prehistoric times. Ice Age survival required people who could subordinate individual desires to group survival needs. The community advantage that Ice Age humans had was real and essential, but it came with responsibilities, pressures, and interdependencies that modern people would find crushing. You'd have to function as part of a survival machine where everyone's life depended on everyone else's performance. An individual failure could mean death for people you cared about. Ice Age community wasn't a supportive social environment. It was a survival strategy that worked only when everyone contributed everything they had to keeping the group alive through conditions that would kill them all if they tried to face them independently. Here's the most humbling truth about the Ice Age. There were no villains plotting your destruction, no evil forces trying to kill you, and no malicious intent behind your suffering. There was just physics, cold, indifferent, unstoppable physics that would crush you with the same casual disregard it showed for everything else that got in its way. Nature wasn't angry at you. It simply didn't care that you existed. The glaciers that covered most of North America and Europe weren't malevolent ice monsters. They were continental-sized bulldozers made of frozen water that moved forward at a pace of a few feet per year. but with unstoppable force that could flatten mountains, carve out valleys, and erase entire ecosystems without even slowing down. These ice sheets were miles thick and contained enough frozen water to change global sea levels by hundreds of feet. When glaciers moved through forested areas, they didn't destroy the trees out of spite. They simply pushed forward with the weight of billions of tons of ice, and everything in their path got ground into powder, or pushed aside like it was made of paper. Entire forests that had existed for thousands of years disappeared under ice that advanced with the inevitability of geological time. Flooding from glacial melt wasn't a punishment for human sins. It was just what happened when massive amounts of ice melted faster than drainage systems could handle the water. Valleys that had been safe for generations could become death traps overnight when ice dams failed and released floods that could drown entire regions in a matter of hours. Species extinction during the Ice Age wasn't the result of divine judgment or natural selection based on moral worth. It was just mathematics. Animals that couldn't adapt to rapidly changing climate conditions died out, regardless of how magnificent, intelligent, or well-adapted they had been to previous conditions. The ice didn't care about preserving biodiversity or maintaining ecological balance. A single slip into a frozen river was the end, not because the river was evil or because you deserved to die, but because water at freezing temperatures would cause hypothermia in minutes. Your muscles would stop working properly, and drowning would be inevitable unless you could get out immediately. The river didn't want to kill you. It was just cold water following the laws of physics. The wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes wasn't trying to hurt you. It was just air moving from high-pressure systems to low-pressure systems, following atmospheric physics that had no awareness of or concern for your survival needs. Wind chill was a mathematical relationship between temperature and air movement that would kill you with the same indifference it showed to everything else. Starvation wasn't a moral failing or divine punishment. It was just the biological result of consuming fewer calories than your body needed to maintain basic functions. Your body would start consuming its own tissues to stay alive, following metabolic processes that had no consideration for your suffering or your desire to continue living. Predator attacks weren't personal vendettas or signs that you were being targeted by hostile forces. They were just animals following their evolved hunting behaviors, seeking food sources that would allow them to survive in the same harsh conditions you were facing. The cave lion that killed you wasn't evil. It was just hungry. Frostbite wasn't a curse or punishment. It was the predictable result of tissues being exposed to temperatures cold enough to freeze cellular fluids, causing ice crystals to form that would damage cell walls and cut off blood circulation. Your fingers and toes would turn black and die following biological processes that operated regardless of your wishes. Disease and infection followed microbial logic that had no awareness of your hopes, dreams, or family responsibilities. Bacteria and viruses reproduced in conditions that favored their survival. And if those conditions happened to exist in your body, they would multiply and potentially kill you through processes that had nothing to do with justice or fairness. Avalanches, rock slides, and other geological events occurred according to physics principles involving gravity, structural integrity, and material stress that operated independently of human presence. You could be killed by falling rocks, not because the mountain was angry, but because geological forces had reached tipping points that released stored energy in destructive ways. Weather systems followed atmospheric dynamics that operated on scales so large that human survival was essentially irrelevant to their formation and movement. Blizzards, ice storms, and temperature drops that could kill you in hours were just expressions of thermodynamic principles that had no awareness of their effects on human life. The psychological challenge of facing an indifferent universe was enormous, because humans naturally look for meaning, purpose, and intentionality in their experiences. But the Ice Age forced people to confront the reality that most of their suffering wasn't meaningful. It was just the result of living in conditions governed by physical laws that operated without regard for human welfare. Every hour you lived in Ice Age conditions was essentially a victory against physics, a temporary success in maintaining body temperature, finding sufficient calories, avoiding injury, and staying ahead of the various physical processes that would kill you if given the opportunity. Your survival wasn't a reward for virtue. It was a brief triumph over indifferent natural forces. The ice sheets, weather systems, and ecological changes that defined the Ice Age weren't obstacles placed in your path by hostile intelligence. They were natural phenomena following physical laws that had been operating since the formation of the planet and would continue operating long after humans were extinct. Your ancestors, who survived the Ice Age, weren't chosen by destiny or protected by divine intervention. They were just the small percentage of humans whose combination of skills, luck, and circumstances allowed them to temporarily avoid being killed by natural forces that eliminated most everything else that existed during that time period. The true enemy wasn't predators, other humans, or even starvation. It was entropy, the fundamental physical principle that causes organized systems to break down over time. Your body, your shelter, your tools, and your social group were all organized systems that required constant energy input to prevent decay and dissolution. Nature during the Ice Age wasn't cruel or kind. It was just nature, following the same physical laws that govern everything from atomic interactions to galactic formation. The fact that these laws were incompatible with human survival was just an unfortunate coincidence from the human perspective, but perfectly normal from the universe's perspective. Your survival in Ice Age conditions would essentially be a rebellion against physics, a temporary success in maintaining organization and function in the face of natural forces that were constantly working to break down every system you depended on for staying alive. Every day you survived was a small victory against the indifferent universe that was trying to kill you without even knowing you existed. Let's be completely honest about why you'd never survive the Ice Age. You'd probably be dead before lunch on your first day. Not because you're weak or incompetent, but because you're the product of a completely different world with completely different survival requirements. And everything about modern life has prepared you for conditions that are the exact opposite of what Ice Age humans face daily. You'd freeze before noon because your modern body is adapted for heated buildings, synthetic clothing, and climate-controlled environments. Your ancestors were human furnaces wrapped in animal skins. You're more like a tropical houseplant that would wilt the moment you stepped outside into conditions that were designed to kill anything that wasn't perfectly adapted for surviving them. You'd panic within hours because your psychological preparation is based on living in a world with safety nets, emergency services, and backup plans for every conceivable problem. Ice Age humans developed mental resilience through generations of facing problems that had no solutions except perfect execution under impossible conditions, while you've been trained to expect help when things go wrong. You'd eat something poisonous within days, because your food identification skills are based on grocery store labels and expiration dates, not intimate knowledge of which plants, berries, and fungi would kill you versus which ones would provide essential nutrients. Your ancestors learned to distinguish between safe and deadly foods through trial and error that often involved watching other people die from mistakes. You'd make a fatal fire-making error within a week because your experience with fire is based on matches, lighters, and gas stoves that provide instant, reliable flames. Ice Age firemaking required mastery of techniques that took years to learn and had to be executed perfectly in conditions where failure meant death for everyone who depended on that fire. But here's what's truly remarkable about your Ice Age ancestors. They didn't just survive these impossible conditions. They thrived, innovated, adapted, and endured through circumstances that would defeat every modern technology we have today. They succeeded where you would fail, not because they were superhuman, but because they became exactly the kind of humans that those conditions demanded. They didn't just endure suffering. They found ways to create meaning, beauty, and culture while living through conditions that would break modern people psychologically within weeks. They painted masterpieces on cave walls, carved intricate figurines, and developed complex spiritual beliefs while barely surviving conditions that would challenge your sanity just to witness, much less live through. Their innovations weren't just clever survival tricks. They were technological and cultural breakthroughs that laid the foundation for everything modern humans have achieved. They invented tools, techniques, and social systems that allowed them to survive in conditions that would defeat modern engineering. And they did it using nothing but intelligence, cooperation, and stubborn refusal to give up. They adapted to environmental challenges that would render most modern survival equipment useless. Your Gore-Tex clothing, freeze-dried food, and GPS navigation systems would be worthless in Ice Age conditions. But they learned to thrive using materials and methods that they developed from scratch while facing constant threats to their survival. Their endurance wasn't just physical toughness. It was psychological resilience that allowed them to maintain hope, cooperation, and cultural development while living through trauma that would require armies of modern therapists to address. They found ways to process grief, fear, and despair that allowed them to continue functioning when most people would collapse. Their suffering wasn't meaningless hardship. It was the crucible that forged everything that makes modern human civilization possible. They developed language, art, social cooperation, technological innovation, and cultural transmission systems while fighting for survival against conditions that would eliminate most life forms on Earth. They gave us everything we have today. Language that allows complex communication, cultural knowledge that accumulates across generations, social systems that enable large-scale cooperation, and technological foundations that support modern civilization. Every word you speak, every tool you use, and every social institution you benefit from exists because they refused to die during the most challenging conditions in human history. Your existence today is proof that they succeeded against impossible odds. Every person alive today is descended from Ice Age survivors who managed to live long enough to reproduce, despite facing conditions that would kill modern people within hours. You exist because they were tough enough, smart enough, and stubborn enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. You wouldn't survive a day in the Ice Age, but that's not an insult. It's a recognition that you're the beneficiary of thousands of generations of people who survived, so that you could live in conditions where Ice Age survival skills aren't necessary. Your softness is evidence of their success, not proof of your failure. They survived so you wouldn't have to. Every modern comfort you enjoy, heated buildings, reliable food sources, medical care, protection from predators, exists because they endured conditions that would kill you, and they did it well enough and long enough to create the foundations of the world you live in today. The Ice Age humans who survived weren't just our ancestors. They were the toughest, smartest, most resourceful people in human history, and they proved it by living through conditions that would challenge every survival expert, every modern military unit, and every advanced technology we have today. You wouldn't last a day in the Ice Age, but because they lasted thousands of years, you don't have to. Their survival was your inheritance, and their suffering was the price they paid, so that you could live in a world where Ice Age survival skills are museum curiosities rather than daily requirements. The next time you complain about modern inconveniences, slow internet, cold coffee, traffic jams, remember that you're living in paradise compared to the world your ancestors survived. They faced real problems so that your biggest challenges could be trivial annoyances that would have seemed like impossible luxuries to people who had to earn fire every day just to stay alive. Your ancestors didn't just survive the Ice Age. They conquered it so completely that they transformed the entire planet into a world where their descendants could thrive. They turned an ice-covered death world into the foundation for human civilization. And they did it one generation at a time through suffering, innovation, and determination that modern people can barely imagine. You exist because they refused to quit when quitting would have been the logical choice. And every day you live in comfort and safety is a testament to their success at the most important task in human history, not dying when everything was trying to kill them.